Joel Slater had made up his mind the way a man makes up his mind when there is nothing left in the world to change it, quietly, completely, and with the kind of bone-deep certainty that settles in after too many years of too much living. He was 38 years old in the autumn of 1882, and he had decided that he was done. Done with cattle drives, done with trail boss work, done with the sort of men who rode with you one season and buried you the next. Done with saloons and dust-choked towns and the endless, grinding machinery of ambition. Done, if he was being honest with himself on the long rides home across the Texas Panhandle, with people in general. Not out of hatred. He had moved past hatred somewhere around the time he crossed into his mid-30s, but out of a weariness so thorough it had worked its way into his joints and the back of his eyes, and the particular way he held his jaw when a stranger walked toward him. He had purchased 40 acres outside the small town of Caldwell, Kansas, just south of the Arkansas River, back in the spring of that same year. 40 acres was not a cattle empire. It was not the kind of spread that would make men sit up straight at the bank. But it had a creek, a modest 3-room house that had been built by a German farmer who gave up and moved east, a good barn with a sound roof, and enough pasture to run a small herd of his own cattle without breaking his back every morning before sunrise. It had, most importantly, a fence line on 3 sides and a long stretch of open boundary along the southern edge, where the neighboring 40 acres had sat empty since the German farmer sold them separately before departing. That empty southern pasture had been, until recently, one of the things Joel Slater liked best about his new life. He had spent the summer of 1882 doing exactly what he had promised himself he would do. He woke when he woke. He fed his 12 head of cattle. He fixed the fence posts along the north boundary that the winter had worked loose, and he repaired the hinges on the barn door, and he planted a kitchen garden behind the house with more tomatoes than any single man could eat before they went to rot. He made trips into Caldwell only when necessary, for flour, for salt, for the occasional letter from his brother Emmett, who was ranching down in the Texas Hill Country, and had the decency not to ask too many questions about Joel's sudden decision to disappear from the working world. He did not make friends in town. He nodded at people the way a man nods when he has fulfilled his social obligation and would like to move on now. The owner of the general store, a square-shouldered woman named Mrs. Pickett, had tried twice to engage him in conversation about the local gossip and received polite but thorough deflection on both occasions. The minister had stopped by his property once in August and been offered a glass of water and a firm handshake, which Joel felt was a generous donation of his time. He was not unhappy, he would have told you. He was something else, something that did not yet have a name for him, a man between things, perhaps, or a man who had crossed a long distance and was simply standing still for a moment to breathe. October arrived with a cold snap that turned the grass along the creek copper and gold, and Joel was mending a section of fence along the eastern boundary one Tuesday morning when he heard it, the sound of a wagon on the road that ran between his property and the empty southern pasture, and then the sound of it stopping. He did not look up immediately. He worked the wire through the wooden post and bent it back and twisted the end with his pliers, and then he heard a voice. "Excuse me," the voice said. "I am sorry to bother you." It was a woman's voice, and it was clear and direct, the kind of voice that was not seeking permission so much as it was extending a courtesy. Joel set his pliers on the top fence rail and turned around. She was standing at the edge of the road with the reins of a brown mare loosely in her hand, the mare hitched to a buckboard wagon loaded with a remarkable quantity of supplies. She was perhaps 30 years old, perhaps a touch less, with dark hair that had been pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat that was practical rather than decorative. She wore a plain brown riding skirt and a cream-colored blouse under a canvas jacket, and she was looking at him with the sort of direct, measuring gaze that most men in his experience reserved for evaluating horses. "I'm not bothered," Joel said, which was technically true in the physical sense, even if something in his chest had shifted in a way he could not immediately account for. "Good," she said. "I have just purchased the Southern 40. I thought I ought to introduce myself." She walked toward him through the dry grass with a steady, purposeful stride, and she extended her hand the way a man would extend his hand, forthright and clean. "Louisa Holloway." Joel looked at her hand for a half-second and then shook it. Her grip was firm. "Joel Slater." "Mr. Slater," she said, nodding once. "Miss Holloway," he said, because there was no ring on her hand, and he was not a man who missed details even when he had decided to care about very few things. "The deed came through last week," she said, glancing past him at the southern boundary of his property, and then sweeping her gaze across the flat, golden land that was now, apparently, hers. "I understand the previous owner let it go fairly cheap." "The German went back east," Joel said. "I do not know the particulars of the sale." "I got it for $340, she said, which was not a number she shared out of boastfulness, he could tell, but rather out of a habit of plainness. "I have been saving since I was 19. He did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, which he had found was usually the right response when something surprised you. "I plan to run cattle," she said. "Not a large operation. I have 12 heifers coming from a man in Wichita next week. I also have 2 horses." She looked at the buckboard. 3, counting Clara. "Clara is the mare," he said. She glanced back at him with something that might have been the beginning of approval. "Yes." There was a pause in which the wind moved through the grass between them and the mare shifted her weight and blew through her nose. "I will not be a bad neighbor," Louisa Holloway said then, and there was something in the way she said it, not a promise exactly, but a statement of intention, offered simply and without decoration, that made Joel Slater feel, for the first time in a long time, that someone was speaking to him like he was a person worth speaking to carefully. "I am sure you will not," he said. She held his gaze for another moment, then nodded and turned back toward her wagon. "I expect I will have questions about the land eventually," she said over her shoulder. "The drainage patterns and such. Will you mind?" He picked up his pliers from the fence rail. "I will not mind," he said. She climbed up onto the buckboard with the ease of someone who had been doing it all her life, clicked her tongue at Clara, and drove south down the road toward her 40 acres. Joel watched the wagon go. He stood there longer than he had any particular reason to stand there, holding his pliers at his side, watching the buckboard until it turned off the road and into the southern pasture, and disappeared behind the line of cottonwood trees along the creek. Then he turned back to his fence. His hands, he noticed, were not quite as steady as they had been before. He worked for another 2 hours and then went inside and made his noon meal, which was beans from the pot he kept warm on the back of the iron stove, and cornbread, and coffee so strong it was almost chewy. He sat at the wooden table he had built himself in July and ate and looked at the wall, and he told himself that having a neighbor was a complication he had not accounted for, and that he would deal with it with the same efficiency with which he dealt with everything else in his solitary, carefully arranged life. He was mostly convincing. Over the following week, Louisa Holloway proved herself to be a woman of considerable industry. Joel watched, from the polite distance of his own work, as she unloaded her wagon and made 3 separate trips into Caldwell for lumber, and as 2 hired men from town came out and spent 2 days building a proper corral along the eastern edge of her property. He watched as she drove a dozen red-end white heifers off a cattle car at the Caldwell depot, moving among them with a long stick and an utterly calm authority that kept the animals in rough order. He watched as she strung her own fence wire along the southern boundary of his property, which was also the northern boundary of hers, working alone in the early morning before the sun had taken the cold off the day. She was, he observed, entirely capable. She did not need anything from him. He told himself this was convenient. On the 8th day after her arrival, he was drawing water from his well when she came to the boundary fence and leaned her elbows on the top rail and looked across at him with a thoughtful expression. "Mr. Slater," she called. He set his bucket down and walked over. "Miss Holloway." "The creek," she said. "On your property, does it run clean all year?" "From about March through November," he said. "It slows in February and runs a little muddy in spring when the snow comes off, but it is generally reliable." She was quiet for a moment. "Mine dries out mid-August," she said. I noticed the vegetation. I did not account for that. She said it without self-pity, just a woman cataloging a fact. "I will need to dig a tank. I thought you should know in case there is shared runoff to consider." "There is not," he said. "The drainage runs the other direction, toward your southwest corner." She nodded slowly. "That is where I will dig then." She straightened and looked at him. "Thank you." She turned and walked back toward her property, and Joel stood at the fence and watched her go, and thought that she was the most self-contained person he had ever encountered, which was a remarkable thing to think, because he had thought until recently that he himself was the most self-contained person he had ever encountered. It was the following Thursday that the trouble started, or at least, the first trouble, the kind that came with boots and bad intentions. Joel had ridden into Caldwell to collect a feed order, and a letter from his brother Emmett had written to say he was thinking of visiting in spring, and had included a lengthy description of a new stallion he was considering buying. And on his way back through town, he heard raised voices from the direction of the feed store. He did not slow his horse. He had been in enough situations to know that raised voices in a western Kansas cattle town in 1882 were not necessarily his concern. But then he heard a woman's voice, and it was clear and direct and entirely without the edge of panic, and he recognized it. He turned his horse and rode toward the feed store. Louisa Holloway was standing in the street outside the store with her chin up and her hands very still at her sides, facing a broad man with a red face, and a belt so wide it could have doubled as a saddle girth. The man's name was Cal Durbin. Joel had heard the name in town, associated with a medium-sized cattle operation east of Caldwell, and an outsized sense of local entitlement. There was another man behind Durbin, younger, with the look of a hired hand who did whatever he was told. "The price of that parcel was set 3 years ago by Henkel himself, and I had first right of refusal," Durbin was saying, his voice carrying down the street with the ease of a man accustomed to having it carry. "You had no business buying it out from under me." "Mr. Durbin," Louisa said, and her voice was even and measured, "I purchased the land through a legal transaction at the Caldwell Land Office. The deed was filed and registered. I am not interested in revisiting that process with you." "You will be interested," Durbin said, and he stepped one step closer, "when you find out how difficult I can make things for a woman running 40 acres on her own with no man to speak for her." Joel had his horse beside them before he had made a conscious decision to move. He stepped down from the saddle with the unhurried ease of someone who had done so 10,000 times and looped his reins around the hitching post and looked at Cal Durbin. "Is there a problem?" Joel said, and it was not a question, quite. Durbin turned his red face toward him. "Who are you?" "Joel Slater. I am her neighbor." He said it simply, without inflection, as if he were stating a weather condition. Something shifted in Durbin's expression. He looked Joel over, the height, the quiet, the particular way a man who has spent 20 years on the open range carries himself, and made the calculation that a man like Cal Durbin makes when he recognizes that the situation has moved outside his advantage. "This is between me and the woman," Durbin said. "There is nothing between Mr. Durbin and me," Louisa said, without looking at Joel. "The matter is resolved. The land is mine." She picked up the parcel she had apparently set down on the porch of the feed store, flour and salt and a paper-wrapped block of something, and tucked it under her arm. "Good day, Mr. Durbin." She walked to her buckboard and loaded her supplies. Durbin stared at Joel for another moment with the expression of a man counting his options. "She has a neighbor," Joel said again, the same quiet way, and left it at that. Durbin turned and walked away, his hired man trailing behind. Louisa had climbed up onto the buckboard. Joel untied his horse and mounted up. He rode alongside her buckboard for a moment as she turned it in the street. "You did not need to do that," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him sideways from under the brim of her hat, and for the first time something softened in her face, just a fraction, just a small easing of the careful composure she held around herself like a working garment. "Thank you, Mr. Later," she said. "Joel," he said before he thought about it. She looked at him for another moment. "Louisa," she said. Then she clicked at Clara and drove north out of town, and Joel rode beside her for the 2 miles back to their properties without either of them saying another word, and it was the most comfortable silence he had encountered in a very long time. That evening Joel sat on his porch with his coffee and looked at the darkness to the south, where a single lamp burned in the window of Louisa's house. He had noticed the lamp before, had been aware of it in the peripheral way. You become aware of a new thing in a landscape you had thought you knew completely. But tonight he looked at it directly, and he thought about the way she had stood in front of Cal Durbin, absolutely unafraid, and the way she had said his name, Joel, just the once, as if testing the weight of it, deciding if it fit. He was troubled in a way he recognized but could not easily resolve by the fact that he did not mind thinking about her. He had been very clear with himself about people. He had made a decision. He had been doing fine. He refilled his coffee and went inside and read 3 pages of the almanac until he fell asleep. The first real conversation, the first one that went past names and property lines and practical concerns, happened by accident on a Saturday morning 2 weeks into November, when Louis's fence wire along the north boundary came loose from 3 posts in the night, possibly thanks to a young bull who had apparently tested his boundaries and found them wanting, and 4 of her heifers had wandered through the gap and onto Joel's property. He found them at first light, standing in a loose group near his creek, looking at him with the mild, unconcerned expressions of cattle everywhere, as if they had always meant to be exactly here. He penned them in his corral and rode to Louis's fence line. The gap was obvious. He had the wire tensioned and 2 posts reset before he heard the sound of her boots in the frost-stiff grass behind him. "Oh," she said, and stopped. He looked back at her. She was dressed for work, heavy canvas trousers under a split riding skirt, her jacket buttoned to the collar, her hair in a quick braid. She looked at the repaired fence and then at him with an expression that moved through surprise and settled into something complicated. "I was coming to do that," she said. "I was already here," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Your corral," she said. "My 4. They are fine. I will help you drive them back." They worked the heifers back through the gate together, moving slowly and easily in the cold morning air, and Louisa moved cattle the way Joel had noted before, with a calm authority that the animals seemed to respond to without being pushed. When the last heifer was through and the gate closed, Louisa leaned on the gate post and looked out at her herd. "That bull," she said, with a sigh that was equal parts irritation and resignation. "He is young," Joel said. "He will settle." "He had better." She pushed her hat back slightly and looked at the sky. "I appreciate the repair, Joel, truly." He was going to say it was nothing, but she turned toward him before he could and said, "Have you eaten?" He had not. He had come out at first light directly from bed. "I have," she said, "but I made enough biscuits this morning for an army and I cannot eat them all before they go hard." She said it plainly without coyness, as if feeding a neighbor who had repaired her fence before breakfast was a logical transaction rather than an invitation. "If you want," he wanted. He had not realized how much until she said it. They sat at her kitchen table, a better table than his, he noted, with a cloth on it and a jar with the last of the autumn wildflowers going dry in it, and he ate 3 biscuits with butter and a fried egg and drank her coffee, which was better than his, and she sat across from him and ate 1 biscuit and watched him with the same measuring, direct gaze she had turned on him the day they met. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "Since March," he said. "Bought the place in February, moved in March." Before that, he considered the question. "Trail boss," he said. 7 years, before that ranch hand, before that working cattle drives out of Texas. "I was 19 the first time I crossed the Kishom Trail." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "Where did you start?" "Uvalde County, Texas," he said. "My father had a small place. He died when I was 15. He said it matter-of-factly, the way you say something that is finished and gone. I worked where I could after that." She nodded. "I grew up in Missouri," she said. "My father was a farmer. He had ideas about what daughters were good for." The way she said it was not bitter, but it had an edge to it, the edge of a woman who had decided years ago how she felt about something and moved on from it. "I came west when I was 23. Worked as a cook for a cattle operation in Oklahoma Territory for 4 years, saved everything I could." "That is where you learned to work cattle," he said. She looked at him. "Was it obvious?" "You handle them like someone who was taught by a good cowhand," he said, "not like someone who read about it." Something glinted in her eyes, warmth or something near it. "Tom Lacey," she said. "He was the ranch foreman. Old man, 60 if he was a day, had been working cattle since before the war. He said I had a better instinct for it than half the men he hired." "He was right," Joel said. The words came out before he had assembled them, which was unusual for him, and he saw the faint color that moved into her face and understood that she had heard the sincerity in it, which made him unexpectedly aware of his own hands on the table. She looked out the window at the pasture. "I want to make this work," she said quietly. "I do not expect it to be easy. I know what people in town think about a woman running her own operation." "What do they think?" "That it will fail," she said. "That it is amusing or sad, depending on who you ask." She looked back at him. "Cal Durbin is not the only one who had opinions about that parcel." "Durbin will not bother you," Joel said, and he meant it in the simple, factual way he meant most things. She looked at him for a long moment. "You sound very sure of that." "I have dealt with men like Durbin my whole working life," he said. "They make noise when they think no one is paying attention. They stop when someone is." "And you will keep paying attention," she said. It was not quite a question. "I am your neighbor," he said. "It is practical." She smiled then, a real smile, the first full one he had seen from her, and it changed her face entirely, opened something up in it that he had not known was closed. It was not a simple smile. It held years in it, and humor, and something that Joel Slater, who had spent 2 decades reading the landscape for danger and opportunity, recognized without being able to name. He rode home an hour later and thought about that smile for most of the day, which irritated him thoroughly, and which he refused to examine too closely. November deepened, and the cold settled in earnest over the Kansas plains. The wind came out of the north in long, moaning gusts that cut through every gap in the barn siding, and made the cattle bunch together against the south fence. Joel spent 3 days insulating his barn with hay bales on the outside walls and checking his water supply, and through the fence line he could see Louisa doing the same, working in a heavy coat with her braid tucked down inside her collar. On the second evening of a particularly vicious cold spell, he noticed that her lamp was not lit at the usual hour. He stood on his porch looking at the dark window and told himself it was none of his business, and went back inside and sat down with his almanac and read the same sentence 4 times. Then he got up, pulled on his heavy coat, and walked across to her fence. He knocked on her door. There was a moment of silence, and then her voice came through the door, rough and thick. "Who is it?" "Joel Slater," he said. A pause. Then the door opened a few inches, and she looked at him with red-rimmed eyes and a face that had the flushed, drawn look of a fever. "I am fine," she said. "You do not look fine," he said. "Thank you," she said dryly. "Good evening, Joel." She tried to close the door, and he said, "Have you eaten today?" The pause was answer enough. "Let me make you something," he said. "I do not need." "I know you do not need," he said, and he kept his voice even, not arguing, just steady. "But I am here and you are sick and it is 20 degrees and your lamp was not lit. So let me make you something." She looked at him for another moment with the expression of a woman who has been self-sufficient for so long that the offer of help was genuinely disorienting, and then she stepped back from the door and let him in. He made her soup from the stock pot on her stove. She had provisions enough: onions and dried beef and a half jar of preserved tomatoes. And he built the fire in her bedroom up high, and found the extra blanket on the chest at the foot of her bed, and brought it out to her where she was sitting at the kitchen table, wrapped in her first blanket like an indignant caterpillar, refusing to be put to bed until she had eaten. She ate half the soup and then looked up at him. "You are very determined," she said. "I have been told," he said. "Is this—" she started and then stopped, looking at the bowl and then looked up again with her direct, undefended eyes. "Is this just practical, the neighbor thing?" He looked at her. The lamp was burning between them on the table, and in its light she looked feverish and tired and entirely herself, not performing composure, not holding anything at a careful distance, just a woman who was sick and had let someone in and was now asking a straight question. "I do not know," he said honestly, which was more honest than he had been with himself all month. She held his gaze. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. He stayed until she was in bed and the fire was built up and the soup was covered on the stove, and then he walked home through the frozen dark and went to bed himself and lay looking at the ceiling for a long time before he fell asleep. She was better in 3 days. On the 4th day she came to his fence and said, "Thank you for the soup." Her voice was back to its usual clear, direct register. Her color was good. She looked, if anything, more solid than ever, the kind of person who comes through an illness the way a fence post comes through a hard winter, settled deeper in the ground than before. "It was soup," he said. "It was more than soup," she said. He looked at her. "I have not had anyone look after me in a very long time," she said. She said it without complaint, just as a fact delivered in the same plain way she delivered all her facts. "I am not used to it." "Neither am I," he said. "Looking after someone." She tilted her head slightly. "You did it well. You were a cooperative patient." "I was a terrible patient," she said, and the corner of her mouth curved. "You were," he agreed. She laughed then, an actual laugh, short and bright, surprised out of her, and it rang out across the frost-stiff grass between them and lodged somewhere in Joel Slater's chest with the precision and permanence of a well-driven fence post. He was in serious trouble, and he knew it. December arrived, and with it the business of winter, the daily hauling of hay, the checking of water tanks before they iced over, the patching of whatever the wind decided to take apart. Joel found himself manufacturing reasons to be near the boundary fence at times when he might reasonably expect to see Louisa working her side of it, which was a habit he recognized as thoroughly unlike himself and could not seem to correct. She was always working. He had never in his life met a person who worked with such consistent, unglamorous dedication, not the performance of effort, but the actual, sustained thing. She was up before dawn and she worked until dark, and then she went inside and presumably kept on doing something useful, because her lamp burned late most nights. She did not complain about the cold or the loneliness or the weight of running 40 acres on her own with only Clara and 3/4 of a herd for company. He found himself telling her things. He had not planned it. It happened gradually, the way water shapes stone, not by force but by repetition. They began meeting at the fence in the evenings, just for a few minutes, and then for longer, and they talked about the cattle and the weather and the price of hay in Caldwell, and the logistics of the tank she was digging in the spring. And then one evening in mid-December he found himself telling her about the winter of 1873, when he had been 29 and trail bossing a drive that went badly wrong when a blue norther hit them north of the Red River, and they lost 11 head in 2 days and 1 man to the cold. He had not told that story to another person in years. She listened without interruption, her elbows on the fence rail, her face turned toward him in the gathering dark, and when he was finished she was quiet for a moment. "Was that when you knew?" she asked. "Knew what? That you wanted to stop?" He had not thought about it quite that way before. "No," he said slowly. "Not then. I thought about it then, but I stayed on another 9 years. He looked out at the dark pasture. "I think I knew when I turned 38. I woke up one morning on a drive out of Abilene and I looked around at the camp and realized I could not remember the names of half the men I had hired that season." She was quiet. "They were good men," he said. "Decent men. I had hired them, ridden with them for 3 months, and I had not learned their names." He paused. "That was when I knew." "Not that you were tired," she said. "No, that I had gotten the distance wrong." He looked at her. "There is a useful amount of distance. It keeps you clear-headed, and then there is too much and it turns into something else." She looked back at him steadily. "I know about that," she said softly. He waited. "I was engaged once," she said, "in Missouri before I came west." She said it with the same plain precision she used for everything, but he heard the weight underneath it. "He was a farmer. Sensible man, steady man. I thought that was enough." She shook her head slightly. "I kept myself so far behind glass that," he said eventually, he felt like he was courting a portrait. "Very pretty, very still, very far away." "Was he right?" Joel asked. She considered. "Partly," she said. "I was afraid of being needed in the ordinary way, of becoming smaller to fit into someone else's shape." She paused. "I came west to find out what my own shape was." He looked at her in the darkness, at the clean line of her profile against the gray sky, and he felt something that had been clenched in him for a very long time begin, slowly and not without resistance, to loosen. "I think you found it," he said. She turned to look at him, and in the dim light her eyes were very dark and entirely open. "I think so," she said. Christmas came to the Kansas plains in the way it always came there, with a silence so complete it felt deliberate, as if the land itself had decided to pause. Snow fell on Christmas Eve, a clean, soft fall that covered everything and turned the pastures into a single, unbroken white, and Joel looked out at it from his porch and felt, for the first time in several years, that the world was not an entirely hostile arrangement. He had bought a small thing in Caldwell the week before. He had told himself he was in town for salt, and that he just happened to notice it in Mrs. Pickett's store, a pair of leather work gloves, fine quality, lined, stitched with a small flower pattern along the cuffs that he thought she might find either useful or amusing or possibly both. He had wrapped them in brown paper and tied them with a bit of string, and he had set them on the counter and looked at them and told himself this was a perfectly ordinary thing for a neighbor to do at Christmas. He carried them to her fence on Christmas morning. She came to the door when he knocked, wearing a heavy wool dress and her hair down. He had not seen her hair down before, and it was longer than he had imagined, dark and loose over her shoulders, and he was aware of a sudden and considerable warmth in the vicinity of his sternum. "Merry Christmas," he said, and held out the package. She looked at it and then at him, and then she said, "Come in out of the cold," and stepped aside. The inside of her house smelled like wood smoke and something baking corn cake, he discovered, which she had made that morning along with a pan of dried fruit preserves that she had put up herself in October. Her house was small and neat, and everywhere in it were the small evidences of her particular character. A shelf of 5 books that had been read until the spines broke and were held together with string. A pair of boots by the door so repaired they were half patches and still clearly beloved. A faded yellow curtain at the kitchen window that had nothing practical to recommend it, and everything to recommend it in terms of color and the particular way it moved in the draft. She sat down at her table and opened the package and looked at the gloves for a long moment. "Joel," she said. "They are practical," he said quickly. "They are beautiful," she said. He looked at them. "I noticed the stitching," he said. "I thought you might not mind the pattern." She ran her thumb over the small flowers along the cuff. "I do not mind the pattern at all." She looked up at him, and there was something in her face that he felt all the way through him, a vulnerability in it, open and unguarded, that she did not often show, and the fact that she was showing it to him right now, in her own kitchen on Christmas morning, with her hair down and her boots by the door, was the most significant thing that had happened to Joel Slater in a very long time. "I did not get you anything," she said. "You gave me a year of decent coffee," he said. She laughed, that short, bright, surprised laugh, and then she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers for just a moment, just a second, a brief warm pressure before she withdrew it. "Stay for breakfast," she said. He stayed. They ate corn cake and preserves and drank coffee and looked out the yellow-curtained window at the white silent world. And they talked about small things and large things with the ease of people who have been in each other's company long enough that silence and speech both fit comfortably. She told him about Christmas in Missouri when she was a child, about her mother's mince pies and a particular Christmas when it did not snow, and the whole family was bitterly disappointed because they had built their expectations around the idea of snow in a place where it only sometimes came. He told her about Christmas on the trail, the years when they were driving late because of a delayed start, or a bad river crossing, or a hard market at the end, and Christmas found them somewhere between Texas and Kansas in the open dark with a cold fire and hard biscuits, and the sound of the cattle moving softly in the dark. "Did you not mind?" she asked. "I did not know to mind," he said. "I had been working since I was 15. Christmas was a date on the calendar." She looked at him with that measuring, careful attention she gave to everything. "Do you mind now?" He looked around her kitchen at the corn cake and the preserves and the yellow curtain and the shelf of broken-spine books, and then back at her, sitting across from him with her hair down and the new gloves in her lap. "No," he said, "not this year." The color came into her face again, and she looked down at the gloves, and there was a smile there that she was not entirely trying to conceal. January came with a ferocity that even the old hands in Caldwell said was unusual. 3 weeks of temperatures that dropped below zero at night, winds that swept off the Colorado plains with nothing to slow them for 500 miles, and 2 snowstorms that piled drifts against the barn walls and made the daily chores a matter of calculated endurance. Joel and Louisa began working through it together without either of them formally proposing the arrangement. It started practically. He came to help her break the ice on her water tank the first morning after the hard freeze set in, because her tank was deeper than his and the ice was thicker. Then she came to his side to help stack the hay bales that the wind had scattered from the outside of his barn. They fell into a pattern, moving between both properties with a coordination that required almost no discussion, each reading what the other needed and filling the gap the way water fills the low places of a field. Working beside her, he understood her better than 100 conversations could have told him. She was methodical and thorough, and she did not rush, but she was not slow. She worked at the pace that got things done right, the pace of a person who understood that in winter, a mistake cost more than the time you saved by rushing. She was also unexpectedly funny. Not with jokes. She did not tell jokes, but with a dry, offhand humor that came out in the middle of the hardest work. A remark about a particularly obstinate fence post or a heifer with an unreasonable personal grievance, delivered with perfect deadpan, and it cut through the cold and the difficulty the way good humor always does. He found himself laughing more than he had laughed in years. He found himself looking forward to the morning in a way that had nothing to do with the tasks waiting for him. In the 3rd week of January, during the worst of the cold, they were working together to haul water from Joel's creek to Louisa's tank. Hers was iced solid, and the tank she planned to dig in spring was still just a plan. And on the 3rd trip back across the frozen pasture, carrying the heavy yoke with 2 full buckets, Louisa's boot broke through a thin patch of ice over a low spot and she went down hard. The water went everywhere. She was on her feet again in seconds, but she was soaked from the knee down, and the temperature was 15 degrees, and she said, with considerable feeling, a word that Joel was fairly sure she had learned from a very experienced cowhand. He got the empty buckets and the yoke back to the creek bank, and then helped her back to his house. It was closer, and built the fire up and got her boots off and made her sit with her feet near the stove, while he went out and finished the water hauling himself. When he came back in, she was sitting in the chair near the stove with her feet wrapped in a dry piece of flannel he had found on the shelf, and her wet stockings hung over the back of a chair, and she looked at him with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and mortification. "I feel ridiculous," she said. "You broke through ice," he said, hanging up his coat. "It happens." "Not to me," she said, which he thought was very much the thing she would say. He made hot coffee and sat across from her, and they sat in the warmth of his fire while the wind worked at the windows outside, and it was perhaps the most intimate thing, just the two of them in a warm room on a bitter day, her feet by his fire, his flannel on her ankles, and Joel sat in it and felt the last of his determined solitude come loose at the seams. "Louisa," he said. She looked at him. He was not practiced at this. He had not done this, the speaking of inner things to another person, in a long time, possibly ever. He looked at his coffee and then at her and decided that a man who could boss a trail drive for 7 years ought to be able to say a clear sentence. "I want you to know," he said, "that this year since you came has been the best year I have had in a long time." He paused. "I had decided to be done with people. I thought I was too tired. I thought the right move was to pull back until there was only the work left." He looked at her. "I was wrong about that." She was very still. "I am not trying to crowd you," he said. "I know what you came west for. Your own shape, you said. I understand that." He set down his cup. "I just thought you should know how things stand with me." There was a long silence in which the fire crackled and the wind hit the north wall of the house and the stockings on the chair back swayed slightly in the draft. "Joel," she said, and her voice was softer than he had heard it, stripped of its usual clean composure. "I have been trying very hard not to be obvious about something for the last 2 months." He looked at her. "I came west for my own shape," she said. "I found it. I know what I am and what I want and what I am capable of." She held his gaze with that direct, undefended look. "And then I discovered that knowing your own shape does not mean you have to stand alone in it forever." She paused. "It is possible that I have been thinking about that since about October." He felt something expand in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "Since October," he said. "The biscuits," she said. "When you ate 3 of them without any performance of politeness. I thought, this is a man who does not pretend." The corner of her mouth curved. "I found it extremely affecting." He laughed, a full, real laugh, unguarded, and it felt like something shaking loose, something long held finally released. She was laughing too, and then they were both just sitting there in his warm house with the winter outside and the fire between them, laughing at something that was not very funny and extremely funny at the same time. When it settled, he leaned forward and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair. Her fingers wrapped around his. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They sat like that for a long time, her feet by the fire and their hands together, and the world outside was cold and enormous, and it did not trouble either of them at all. February thawed in stages and March came in with the raw, promising smell of mud and water, and with it came Joel's brother Emmett. Emmett Slater was 35, 3 years younger than Joel, broader in the shoulder and considerably louder in the personality, with the same dark eyes and the same deliberate way of moving that the Slater brothers had both inherited from their father. He arrived with his horse, 2 bedrolls, a bag of good tobacco, and an opinion about everything, which he deployed with generous enthusiasm from the moment he rode in. He had been on Joel's property for approximately 4 hours when he noticed Louisa working her side of the fence line, and his expression underwent a rapid and expressive series of changes. "Who is that?" he said. "Louisa Holloway," Joel said. "She owns the Southern 40. Emmett looked at his brother with an expression of undisguised delight. "Joel." "Do not," Joel said. "You have not mentioned a single. I know I have not." "Does she, Emmett?" Emmett grinned broadly and looked back at Louisa. "She is looking this way," he said. "She was." Joel raised a hand in greeting. She raised one back and returned to her fence. "You like her," Emmett said, with the certainty of a man who has known someone their whole life. "Go put your horse in the barn," Joel said. Emmett met Louisa properly at supper that evening, when Joel invited her over in the only way he knew how, which was to walk to her fence and say, "My brother is here, and I made a pot of beef stew, and there is too much of it." She had accepted in the only way she knew how, which was to say, "I will bring the bread." The 3 of them sat at Joel's table with the stew and Louisa's bread and Emmett's unreserved curiosity, and Joel observed that Louisa handled Emmett the way she handled cattle, without any agitation, and with a calm, direct competence that set the general terms pretty quickly. When Emmett asked her how a woman alone had come to own 40 Kansas acres, she told him the precise, factual story, the cooking job, the savings, the legal transaction at the land office, and Emmett looked at Joel with an expression that said absolutely everything he needed to say. Joel looked back at him with an expression that said, "Be quiet." Later, when Louisa had gone home and the brothers were sitting on the porch with the last of the tobacco, Emmett said, "You are going to marry that woman." Joel looked at the lamp burning in Louisa's window. "I am working on it," he said. Emmett looked at him with something softer in his face. The two of them were not men who made open displays of feeling, but they knew each other down to the bone. "Good," he said. "I was worried about you, up here by yourself." He paused. "You look tired, Joel, the kind of tired that sleep does not fix." Joel was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I was. You do not look it now." Joel looked at the lamp. "No," he said. "I do not suppose I do." Emmett stayed a week. In that week he proved himself useful with fencing and useless at milking the one dairy cow Louisa had acquired from a family leaving for Colorado. And he told stories about their shared childhood with the enthusiastic and slightly embellished quality that Joel had always loved about his brother. And he made Louisa laugh 3 times, which was 2 more times than anyone else had managed in their first week of knowing her. When he left, he gripped Joel's hand and said, "Do not wait too long, brother." Spring arrived for real in April, bringing with it green grass and mud and the nesting of the meadowlarks in the fence posts, and with it came the digging of Louisa's water tank in the southwest corner of her property. Joel helped, along with 2 hired men from Caldwell, and they had it done in 4 days. A good clay-bottom tank that caught the snowmelt and the spring rain, deep enough to last through August. On the evening of the 4th day, when the workers had gone and the tank was full with clear cold water, and the last of the sunset was going orange and pink over the western plains, Louisa and Joel stood at the edge of the tank and looked at it with the deep satisfaction of a practical thing well accomplished. "That will do," she said. "That will do," he agreed. She bent down and scooped up a handful of the water and let it fall through her fingers. "I want to say something to you," she said, without looking up. "Say it," he said. She straightened and turned to face him. In the last of the sunset light she was very beautiful in the way that real things are beautiful, not composed for effect, but actual, the beauty of a particular person who has lived in their own face long enough that it tells you everything about who they are. "I do not want to be only your neighbor," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The meadowlark in the nearest fence post sang its evening phrase and was quiet. "Neither do I," he said. "Then what do you want?" She asked, and the directness of it, the absolute refusal to be coy or to circle around it, was so entirely her that he felt it all the way through him. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, "when you are ready. If you are willing." She held his gaze. "I am willing," she said, "and I am ready." He stepped toward her and she did not step back, and he took her face in his hands, work-roughened hands, hands that had spent 20 years on fences and cattle and trail dust, and kissed her in the evening air beside the new water tank, in the slow, deliberate way of a man who is not rushing anywhere at all. She kissed him back in the straightforward, unhurried way she did everything, her hands at his chest, and it was the most natural and the most remarkable thing that had happened in this particular stretch of Kansas in a very long time. They were married in June, in the small clapboard church at the edge of Caldwell, on a Tuesday morning because Tuesday suited them, and because neither of them needed the social occasion of a Saturday wedding. The minister, who had once been told to drink his water and move along, officiated with a warmth that suggested he bore no grudge. Mrs. Pickett from the general store attended along with a handful of the townspeople who had watched, with varying degrees of surprise and approval, the development of the situation at the 2 South Pastures. Emmett came up from Texas. He stood beside Joel at the front of the church, and had the expression of a man whose faith in the general order of things has been vindicated. Louisa came down the aisle in a dress she had made herself over the previous month, good dark blue wool, simply cut, beautiful for its simplicity, wearing the leather gloves with the flower stitching on the cuffs, because it was a cool June morning, and also because she wanted to. and Joel stood at the front of the church and looked at her coming toward him and felt something so complete and clean and right that it did not need a name. They wrote their own vows, which was not exactly common, but which neither of them saw any reason to avoid. Louisa's vows were precise and true and direct as everything else about her. She promised to be his equal, to work beside him, to tell him the truth, and to keep the coffee strong. The church laughed and then was quiet, and the minister had to clear his throat. Joel's vows were shorter. He had thought about them for weeks and had discarded everything elaborate in favor of the plain truth, that he had come to this land planning to be done with the world, and she had bought the neighboring pasture and introduced herself, and she had been the best thing that had happened to him since he drew his first breath, and he intended to spend the rest of his life making sure she did not regret giving him her name to stand beside. The minister pronounced them married, and Joel kissed her properly, and Emmett made a sound of great satisfaction, and outside the church the June sun was warm and the meadowlarks were singing, and the 40 acres to the south and the 40 acres to the north were waiting. They combined the properties. Not legally, immediately, the Kansas land records were what they were, but in practice, from the day after the wedding, the fence along the shared boundary came down, and the 80 acres became one operation, with 2 houses and 2 barns and 2 water sources and a combined herd of 24 cattle, and the beginning of something that was larger than either of them had built alone. Joel moved his things into Louisa's house because hers was better organized and had the yellow curtain, and he sold his own house to a young couple from Ohio who had come west with nothing but determination, which he respected. He kept his barn, and it became the main equipment barn for the expanded operation. That summer they worked together every day with the simple, productive joy of 2 competent people who have found their match, and the work was not less hard, but it was entirely different in quality, the difference between labor that grinds you down alone and labor that builds you up beside someone. Cal Durbin made one more appearance in their story in August when he rode up to their shared boundary on a horse that was too good for a man with a face like his and announced, loudly, that he had spoken to a lawyer about the original sale of the southern parcel and that there were legal questions to be examined. Joel came out of the barn. Louisa came off the porch. They stood together at the gate. "Mr. Durbin," Louisa said, "whatever you spoke to your lawyer about, the deed was filed, registered, and executed legally at the Caldwell Land Office in October of last year. I am happy to show you the documentation if you have genuinely forgot, but I suspect you have not forgotten at all, and you are here because you have decided to be unpleasant rather than because you have a legal standing." She paused. "I would strongly advise against unpleasantness." Durbin looked at Joel. Joel said nothing. He simply looked back. After a moment that went on long enough to make its point, Durbin turned his horse and rode east without another word. Louisa watched him go with a composed expression, and then she turned to Joel and said, "I have had enough of that man." "I believe he has had enough of us," Joel said. She smiled and went back to the porch, and Durbin never came back. The autumn of 1883 was rich and gold and satisfying. Their herd had grown to 30 head. The water tank was performing exactly as expected. Louisa had planted an expanded kitchen garden and put up enough preserved tomatoes, corn, and beans to see them through 2 winters. Joel had built a proper stone foundation under the house and replaced the oldest section of fence on the northern boundary with new posts that would last 20 years. In October, exactly 1 year after Louisa had pulled her buckboard off the road and introduced herself across the fence line, they sat on the porch in the evening with their coffee, her coffee, always her coffee, still better than his, and watched the last of the sunset go down over the plains. "1 year," she said. "1 year," he said. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the particular way of people who have learned each other's gravity, the easy fit of 2 people who know each other well enough to be quiet together without it being a deficit. "Are you still retiring?" she asked, with the dry humor she kept for the best moments. He considered. "I retired from the right things," he said. "The road, the noise, the pretending." He looked out at the 80 acres, at the cattle dark shapes against the golden grass, at the 2 barns and the corral and the water tank and all the evidence of what they had built together. "I did not retire from living." She tilted her head up to look at him. "Good," she said, "because I have plans that will require your participation." He looked down at her. "What sort of plans?" She held his gaze with that direct look she had turned on him the very first morning, that measuring, clear-eyed assessment. "The sort," she said, "that require a larger house." He understood her immediately. He sat up straighter and looked at her, and she looked back at him with a quiet radiance that was more eloquent than any speech. "Louisa," he said. "Spring," she said. "The doctor in Caldwell said spring." He pulled her close and held her, there on the porch in the October evening, and he pressed his mouth against her hair, and he thought that there was nothing in the world, not the trail, not the drive, not the long, empty years of useful solitude, that had ever felt like this. Like the beginning of something rather than the end. "We will need a bigger house," he said. "I already have plans for the extension," she said, muffled against his shoulder. He laughed. "Of course you do." "The east wall," she said, sitting up and looking at him with the brisk energy of a woman who has been waiting to discuss this. "If we take the east wall out 6 feet and put in a proper second room," and then eventually he kissed her. She stopped talking about the east wall and kissed him back, and the evening settled around them, warm and enormous and entirely sufficient. The winter of 1883 was gentler than the last, which everyone in Caldwell took as a personal mercy. Joel and Louisa spent it in the warm industry of preparation. The house extension was laid out in December, and the lumber ordered from Wichita. The room framed in February on the days when the cold relented enough to work, and by March they had added the new room to the east side of the house with a window that looked out over the pasture and let in the morning light in a long gold stripe that reached all the way to the kitchen. Louisa worked through the winter with her characteristic composure and an increasingly limited tolerance for her own limitations, which amused Joel considerably, and which he was careful to find amusing only internally, because he was not a foolish man. She continued to work the cattle until February, and then she conceded to lighter duties with the grace of a person who has made a practical decision rather than a capitulation. He took over the morning cattle work. She ran the house and the accounts and the preserves and the correspondence and the 100 other things that kept the operation functioning, and she did it from a chair near the fire with her feet up and an expression of profound and undisguised impatience. Their son was born on the 14th of April, 1884, in the new East Room in the morning light. The doctor from Caldwell came and went. Emmett had ridden up from Texas with his wife Clara. His wife's name was a source of gentle comedy, given the mare, and they waited in the kitchen while Joel sat with Louisa through the long night and into the morning, holding her hand and being exactly the still, steady presence that she needed. And when the baby arrived and the doctor handed him to Louisa, Joel looked at his son's face, red and indignant and absolutely commanding, and felt something so enormous and wordless that he sat down on the edge of the bed and could not, for a considerable moment, speak at all. "Well," Louisa said, exhausted and bright and entirely herself, looking at the baby. "Hello." The baby expressed a vigorous opinion about the world. "He is loud," Joel said, finding his voice. "He is Emmett's nephew," Louisa said. "What did you expect?" They named him Thomas. Thomas William Slater, for no complicated reason except that they both liked Thomas and Joel's father had been William, and it seemed a good way to carry something forward into the new thing. Emmett met the baby in the kitchen doorway with an expression of such genuine emotional overwhelm that his wife Clara had to pat his back and tell him to compose himself, which he did, barely. "He is the finest-looking baby I have ever seen," Emmett said. "You have only seen 3 babies," Joel said. "He is still the finest," Emmett said, and held Thomas with the careful, concentrated grip of a large man holding something very important, and the baby looked up at him with dark eyes and did not cry, which Emmett took as a personal compliment. Thomas William Slater proved to be a person of strong and early opinions. By 6 months he had views about which people he would graciously allow to hold him Joel, Louisa, Emmett when Emmett visited, and for reasons entirely his own, Clara the mare. By 8 months, he was attempting to pull himself upright on anything with a vertical surface, and expressing volcanic frustration when this did not work. By the time he was walking, Joel had to replace 2 fence posts that had been used as support structures during the learning process. He grew up on 80 acres of Kansas grass with cattle and horses and the wide open sky, and he learned to work alongside his parents from the time he could hold a bucket without dropping it, and he was curious about everything and afraid of very little, and Joel watched him grow with a feeling that he had no words for and did not need any. In the spring of 1886, when Thomas was 2 and had recently demonstrated his ability to say the word fence with remarkable precision and the word please with varying conviction, Louisa told Joel on the porch in the evening with the same quiet directness with which she had told him everything that mattered, that the east room was going to need to be used again. He looked at her. She looked back. "The south wall this time," she said. "If we take the south wall out 8 feet. He laughed and she laughed, and he pulled her into his lap on the porch chair, which was slightly too small for both of them and which neither of them minded at all. Their daughter arrived in November in the second extended room in the evening. She was born with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn quiet, and she screamed for approximately 30 seconds upon arrival, and then looked around the room with an expression of profound assessment and was largely satisfied. They named her Margaret Ruth Slater, and she was the absolute and immediate authority of every room she occupied, which delighted Thomas, who had been hoping for someone to be in charge of things, because he found the responsibility wearing. The years that followed were what years are made of: work and weather and small crises and large triumphs, and the daily accumulation of a life lived in the actual world alongside another person. The cattle operation grew steadily. By 1888, they were running 60 head on the 80 acres plus an additional lease on the Johnson parcel to the east, and they had hired 2 permanent hands, a quiet young man from Missouri named Davis who was good with horses, and an older hand named Crockett who had 30 years of range experience and an encyclopedic knowledge of weather that proved more reliable than any almanac. Joel built a proper ranch house in 1887, not replacing the original, but building new, a 4-room structure with a covered porch on 3 sides, and a kitchen that Louisa had designed herself with the same methodical precision she applied to everything, right down to the placement of the stove and the angle of the windows. The old house became the bunkhouse for Davis and Crockett, which everyone found appropriate. Louisa kept the yellow curtain. It moved from window to window through every change of quarters, faded now to a pale cream but still present, still moving in the draft, still catching the morning light in the particular way she had liked about it from the beginning. Joel had learned not to question the yellow curtain. It was one of the things that made a house a home, and he understood the difference now, deeply and irreversibly, in a way he had not understood it when he was a man with 40 acres and a deliberate retirement from the world. In the evenings, after Thomas and Margaret were in bed and Davis and Crockett had gone to their bunkhouse, Joel and Louisa sat on the covered porch with their coffee and watched the dark plains and talked about the things they had built and the things they still planned. She still made better coffee than he did. He had stopped trying to improve his. There were things you learned to accept and things you learned to appreciate, and the difference between those categories was everything. "Do you remember," she said one evening in the autumn of 1888, watching the same October sunset they had watched 6 years ago from the same direction, "the first morning, when I drove past with the buckboard and you were fixing the fence?" "I remember," he said. "You looked at me," she said, "like I was a problem you had not accounted for." "You were," he said. She looked sideways at him from under the brim of her hat, still the same hat, the practical brim, a new hat now but the same sensibility. And now he looked at her. At the woman who had bought the neighboring pasture and introduced herself in a clear, direct voice, and shaken his hand like a man, and then proceeded over 6 years to utterly undo every plan he had made for a quiet, solitary, uninvested life. At the woman who had taught him, without ever stating it as a lesson, that the distance he had cultivated so carefully was not wisdom but fear, a reasonable fear, earned honestly, but a fear nonetheless. At the woman who had sat across from him at a kitchen table and eaten 1 biscuit while he ate 3, and watched him with her steady, measuring eyes, and decided without any fuss that she intended to trust him. "Now," he said, "you are the best problem I have ever failed to solve." She smiled, that full smile, the one that changed her whole face, the one he had fallen in love with in November of 1882 standing at a fence line in the frost. "That is a terrible thing to say to your wife," she said. "It is an accurate thing," he said. She reached over and took his hand, the way she always did, her fingers wrapping around his, and they sat in the evening light on the porch of the house they had built together on the 80 acres. They had grown together from 2 separate 40-acre beginnings, and the cattle moved in the pasture below, and the meadowlarks sent up the last of their evening songs, and somewhere inside the house, Thomas said something to Margaret that made her laugh, a child's laugh, bright and unself-conscious, ringing out through the open window. Joel Slater had come to this land intending to be done. Done with work, done with noise, done with the wearing, grinding business of existing among people who needed things from him, and of whom he could never quite bring himself to need anything in return. He had pulled his fence lines tight and turned his face to the south and been very thorough about his solitude. And then Louisa Holloway had pulled her buckboard off the road and introduced herself with a firm handshake and a direct gaze, and told him she planned to run cattle on 40 acres and asked about the drainage, and eaten biscuits at his table and fed him soup when he was not sick, and let him feed her soup when she was, and kissed him beside a water tank in the last of an April sunset, and married him on a Tuesday in a blue wool dress with flower-stitched gloves, and given him a son who talked to the fence posts and a daughter who looked at the world like she was deciding whether to accept its terms, and sat on this porch with him every evening for 6 years with better coffee than he would ever make. He had retired from everything, and then she had arrived, and everything he had meant by that word had changed. There was a word for what he had now, and it was not retirement. It was not even a category he had the vocabulary for, in the years before she knocked down the fence between his careful half-life and the actual full thing. It was the word that had been waiting at the end of the long trail, past the dust and the distance and the years of useful solitude, past the decision to be done, past the 40 acres and the German farmer's house and the almanac and the beans on the back of the iron stove. The word was home. The word was her. The word was Thomas laughing inside and Margaret's high clear voice answering him and the yellow curtain in the window and the coffee going cold in his hand, because he had stopped drinking it to look at his wife in the evening light of an October day in Kansas in 1888, and he was not done at all. He was, if anything, just getting started. Louisa turned and found him looking at her. She knew that look by now. She had catalogued all his looks the way she had catalogued the drainage patterns and the water sources and the load-bearing walls, with the meticulous thoroughness of a woman who paid attention to what mattered. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "You," he said, simple as that. She looked at him for a moment with her dark eyes in the fading light, and then she leaned over and pressed her lips to his cheek, warm and unhurried. "Good," she said. Inside, Thomas called out that Margaret had taken his hat, and Margaret informed the household in a clear voice that she had done nothing of the kind. And Joel stood up from the porch chair and held out his hand for Louisa's, and they went inside together, into the warmth and the noise and the full, irreplaceable life they had built from a fence line and a handshake, and the particular grace of two solitary people who had found in each other everything they had not known they were still waiting for. The lamp in the window burned long into the Kansas night, and the 80 acres lay quiet under the stars, and it was, by every measure that mattered, exactly enough.